to more than 60 British organisations, including business and non-profits, calling on the governments to prioritise a list of their different green economic demands. Another one from the BBC is the boss of energy company SSE pushes government to adopt green print, prioritising investment in renewables. One from the Financial Times, shareholder climate rebellions surge despite coronavirus crisis. Shareholder support for climate change resolutions is up 4% on last year. One from The Economist, climate adaptation policies are needed now more than ever. That's an opinion piece from May the 28th. An article from The Guardian highlighting an Oxford University study arguing for a green stimulus package, saying that they create more jobs, deliver higher short-term returns, and lead to increased long-term cost savings. So we're in this strange time where it's not just the usual suspects who are arguing for climate resilient futures. On the next slide, I wanted to share a quote with you from Dr. Gambier. Next slide, yeah, who is a low carbon future scientist at LSE. This is from a report dated recently. He says, whilst input from scientific experts remains welcome and a useful precedent for further action on climate change, we must be careful that decisions which are inescapably moral and political are not placed solely on the shoulders of scientists, especially when significant uncertainties remain. And I think we found in this moment of pandemic that we can't just insist on people facing up to what is happening. We also need to offer a vision of how to respond. Accepting the science isn't going to be enough to ensure that we respond with generosity and justice. I think for many of us, this moment feels like we're standing on the threshold of multiple imagined futures. And as Christians, we want to describe this moment of unfolding in religious or spiritual language. I can see a few people saying they can't see the slides. The rest of the slides are basically one word each, so don't worry too much. It may be because you're on a phone, I'm not sure. So as we're trying to describe this moment in religious or spiritual language, this can be transformative, to remember and to act as though we live in a world created and redeemed by God, who is profoundly interested in what happens to us as material creatures. But using theological language well in times of uncertainty is a real challenge. I want to suggest this evening that our words are spiritually powerful. We can use them as terms to rally around, and the ones we choose to use and how we choose to use them has a role to play in shaping the possible futures we imagine. So as we try to articulate post-coronavirus climate resilient futures, I want to give a very brief introduction to some of the theological language you might be hearing, and maybe suggest some ways that we can use it and think about how it can describe the world we hope to build. So next slide. Yeah, how do we talk faithfully about a climate resilient future? Go on to the next slide. So this slide just says the word lament. Some of the words around that we might hear are things like grief or anger or despair. Some of you may have noticed that the idea of lament is back in fashion in our churches. The idea of teaching ourselves to lament has once again been popularized. But what are we actually asking people to do when we ask them to lament? And what role does that have in a climate resilient future? Well, despite the signs that we have real possibility of government and corporate support for Green New Deal type thinking, I think we're going to need to come to terms with the idea that most of our lifetimes are going to be characterized by global lament. In terms of climate breakdown, there are thresholds we've already crossed. Things will get worse. But lament is not something we can just expunge in an hour-long church service or prayer exercise. It will become the way we position ourselves towards the world. Now, this isn't about manipulating our feelings or participating in our contemporary obsession over whether the way we feel is genuine enough. We ask ourselves things like, how can we lament if we feel too burnt out to cry or express anger? Or how can we lament if we've given up trying to make ourselves care about something that's beyond our control? But the lament described in Scripture belongs to a culture which had professional mourners. Lamenting was so spiritually important that people were assigned to do it properly. It was an art. So maybe a question for us this evening is, how are we developing the art of lament in our communities? Now, lament is different to despair, which is why it's so important that we don't play a dangerous game of manipulating the feelings of others or ourselves. And I think particularly in church contexts, that can become spiritually abusive. We need to be able to make wise choices in this moment, and we can't do that when we're despairing. One way I mitigate despair is acknowledging the openness of the future. This is not to say that God doesn't know the future, but it is to say that I don't know the future, and claiming that I do is hubris, it's arrogance. We are part of a hubristic culture, a culture that's the product of colonization. The idea of our own power is very hard to abandon. It's very easy then to be fatalistic about what will happen if we can't imagine a way out, to speak as though our worst nightmares are the most real. Acting wisely requires some kind of humility about ourselves and our knowledge. In despair, we assume that we know what will happen and that there's nothing to be done. We begin to fear the powers of this world more than we fear God. And if the beginning of wisdom is the fear, that is the awe, the worship of the Lord, we cannot be both wise and despairing. So when we ask people to lament, we need to clearly differentiate ourselves from despairing narratives. Let's go on to the next slide. So what about hope? Well, I think this is directly related to proper lament. I'm often asked, what makes you feel hopeful? And I don't think feeling hopeful has very much to do with being hopeful. Being a hopeful person is, I think, an identity that we can choose to adopt. It can be our stance towards the world, whether we feel hopeful or not. I think it's much like love, a choice. And if we're constantly looking for things that will make us feel hopeful as we imagine a climate resilient future, we're going to hurt ourselves. But if we choose to feel hopeful, if we choose hope, we can invite people in to make that choice with us. And it doesn't replace our lament, so the two go hand in hand. Hopeful living needs our grief and anger because, like hope, they declare knowledge of an alternative way of living. They declare that this moment is sin. We do not have to live this way. And particularly, I want to utter some caution in this time of pandemic that this hopeful stance is very different to language of disguised blessings or even opportunities. It's really normal for us to try and seek meaning in suffering, but there's a big difference between seeking meaning in your own suffering and trying to seek meaning in the suffering of others. Descriptions of silver linings are cruel in this moment of mass death. They give the suggestion that this is a God-ordained or at least God-endorsed pandemic. We need to be able to talk about a post-COVID-19 climate resilient future without suggesting that we view a pandemic as an opportunity. So my next word for this evening on the next slide is apocalypse. And again, you might find that this word is starting to do the rounds while we're talking more about apocalyptic times. And I think this is helpful, not because this virus signals the end of the world, but that apocalypses are times of unveiling, where the way things really are become clear to us. We get a God's eye view. I do want to utter, again, a bit of a word of caution about apocalyptic language. This is a moment to amplify the voices of the most politically and economically oppressed, while acknowledging that while we think of apocalypse as a kind of wake-up call, this is not an equal opportunity learning moment. The most oppressed in our communities have been well aware of the state of the world all along. The other challenge with using apocalyptic language is that it gives the feeling of a passing event, that we're going to get through this moment and come out the other side, and that's unlikely to happen in our lifetimes. So there's a danger of apocalypse language burnout, much like crisis or emergency language. They have real limits to them. And very briefly, finally, the last slide, this idea of the kingdom of God or progress. What are we progressing towards? And just a final word on this. As Christians, we have a really difficult job of holding two things in tension: that we participate in God's resurrecting work and that we will always live with a creation groaning until the return of Jesus. We long for revolutionary change, and also we know that the revolution will not ultimately heal us. And our challenge is to live in the tension of those two things. And I believe that we can do this because as Christians, we believe that any act born out of love is not wasted in God's economy. It is real, more real than the powers of this world, which are passing away. So my question that I want to pose to you this evening, just before I hand over to Tom, is, as Christians, how do we describe the world we long for? Do you have the vocabulary to describe the world that we're wanting to bring about? And how will we begin to use that in our churches and in our communities? Thank you. Over to Tom.
Thanks, Hannah. And I think that's a really great kind of lens to see things through for us tonight. I described Hannah earlier as a poetic and prophetic voice. And I kind of hope that my background, which is as a mechanical engineer working in low carbon building design, I always wish I was a bit more prophetic, a bit more poetic. So thank you, Hannah, for setting us up like that. So my day-to-day job now is trying to decarbonize a county in the Northeast. And it's kind of amazing when your interest or your passion and maybe even your calling can become your day-to-day work. The context for me as a Christian on the left is I'm a member of the Labour Party. I'm also branch secretary in Durham, and I'm an active member of a church in Durham too. But that label of Christian, that kind of thing that brings us all together, is really important tonight, I think. So for me, for my contribution, I'm going to start with some Bible. And if you wanted to use this as some kind of reflection or prayer time, I'm just going to read some verses from the Bible, and then I'm going to read a short poem, and then we'll get into a little bit of a policy discussion. I hope this sets out the scene for where I want us to go this evening. So Isaiah 58 verses 9 to 12 says in the Message translation, "If you get rid of your unfair practices, quit blaming victims, quit gossiping about other people's sins, if you're generous with the hungry and start giving yourself to the down and out, your lives will begin to glow in the darkness. Your shadowed lives will be bathed in sunlight. I will always show you where to go. I'll give you a full life in the emptiest of places. Firm muscles, strong bones. You'll be like a well-watered garden, a gurgling spring that never runs dry. You'll use the old rubble of past lives to build anew. Rebuild the foundations from out of your past. You'll be known as those who can fix anything. Restore old ruins, rebuild, renovate, make the community livable again." And for me, those prophetic words in Isaiah are some that I think as Christians and as Christians negotiating the political sphere, that we should choose to adopt, choose to follow, choose to focus on. A calling to adopt and practices to aim for. Can we be known, can we as Christians on the left be known as those that build anew? Known as restorers of ruins, renovators of community. And as a follow-up to Isaiah, moving to a modern day prophet, a poet and a pastor, Gerard Kelly, he wrote this. And as I say, use this as a prayer, imagining your village, your town, your city, and what it could be. So Gerard Kelly says this: "I see a new city poured out from heaven, dressed for a party, blazing with beauty. Her rooftops are radiant, trees trembling with laughter, and joy like a jewel shines in her streets. From her walls and windows, no weeping is heard. Through her gateways and gutters, floods of tears do not flow. For in her homes and houses, no pain dwells. Bricks once broken down in mourning rise again in song and celebration. Stones thrown down by enmity and envy dare to dance in swirling swathes of mercy. She sings, a million voices rising, the long-lost languages of human hopes, the secret praise of human hearts released at last. Because her God is with her, because his home is made within her walls, because his voice is heard, gentle like the rains of spring, declaring new, new, new. This is the city I see, the future I belong to. This is the blueprint my heart holds on to. Even now in streets that sing another story, even here beneath a darker vision shadow, this metropolis of mercy, promising future realization, active now in love's imagination. This is my dream, and though I wait, and though I long, and though the sacred city may seem slow, still I will hope, still I will pray, still I will today rise up and build. Okay, so why is a passage from the Old Testament and a poem from a pastor in the UK, why is it relevant to today's topic? Why is it relevant to the environment and the climate crisis? For me, I don't think we can talk about the climate crisis without the current crisis in mind and the challenge that we're going to face coming out of it. Do we accept a new normal? or do we create it? For many of us on this Zoom today, we're an interesting group. Next slide, if you want, please, Daniel. These slides are just background, so just they're not that relevant, but yeah. Sorry, one more slide, Daniel, thank you. Yeah, for us on the Zoom today, we're an interesting group, and we come from across the spectrum of Christian communities. I guess we're mostly in the UK, and I guess we might label ourselves as sitting on the left of the political spectrum. And even more specifically today, we've kind of self-selected to come on a summer school on a sunny evening to discuss climate and our local environments. So I want to suggest with this wide-ranging group, in the context of this new city that we're called to build, and being known as those who can fix anything, people of faith, we've got a responsibility to help shape the future and the response of this crisis. Next slide, please, Daniel. Some of the thinking that really helped shape the 2019 manifesto for the Labour Party, and I get that not everyone on the call may be a Labour supporter, and I'm sure that many of us have certain views about the 2019 election, just bear with me. But some of the policy thinking that shaped the idea of a Green New Deal, that shaped the manifesto, was the idea of a Green New Deal. And that term, the Green New Deal, has been popularised in the States over the last few years, but originated in the UK in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And it's a broad set of ideas that kind of paint out a picture that says that we need large and quick mobilisation to transform our society into a cleaner, lower carbon, sustainable economy, but also building that in the context of and trying to tackle issues around poverty, inequality, and injustice. The success and popularity of the term in the States is partly linked to the post-depression, pre-war kind of times, and the transformation of New Deal policies in the 1930s, which were kind of mass investment in public works, updates to legislation, and change of thinking that really laid the foundations for what we saw in the US and the foundations for it to become the economic and military powerhouse we know today. Those of you who are historians and economists will have to bear with me a little bit for my simplified understanding there. But for me, in the kind of low carbon world, the Green New Deal is a mirror to that original New Deal. And in the context of the 2018 International Panel on Climate Change report that suggested that we have 12 years to cut emissions or risk climate catastrophe and climate chaos, and the Green New Deal in that context suggests we should invest in infrastructure to move us to all the way to low carbon travel, to improve efficiency in our homes, to stop burning fossil fuels, or where we have to burn those fossil fuels to capture their emissions as well as asking us to make new low carbon jobs and make sure they're well paid, acknowledging that low carbon jobs in engineering, adaptation to climate crises and ecology, but also that low carbon jobs can be in caring roles, whether it's teachers or nurses, those roles that we know now as key workers. Those roles tend to be pretty low carbon too. And then the Green New Deal asks us to think globally to ensure that developing countries are not left behind, so that they can afford a similar transition. Understanding that actually with climate change and with the climate crisis, the places that it will be most extreme, they're the places that people will have the least opportunity to adapt. We will see climate refugees that'll be forced to leave their homes, and the Green New Deal doesn't forget them. So for me, the vision of a Green New Deal, and if I were in government, would be some of the inspiration for fixing things. It'd be some of the inspiration to restore old ruins, to rebuild and renovate, to make the community livable again, as Isaiah asked of us. But unbelievably, I'm not in government, and the left more broadly are not at the table. We ourselves are going through a process of rebuilding and restoring. But I think we have a role to play. And interestingly, bringing up a conversation that we used to talk about all the time, it looks like the Green New Deal will be happening in the EU as Europe comes out of this crisis. It could be nice if we could join in, couldn't it? But less of that. And that leads us on to a little bit of time of discussion in our groups. Earlier on in the evening, as Hannah was speaking, I posted in the chat It was just after some comments about my beard growth. So if you go to there on the chat, you can find some questions, which says summer school questions. So we're going to have kind of 15-20 minutes of time in breakout groups. So there's 4 slides in the questions, and they kind of hope to get you to talk about this new future that we might want to build, and to understand how we might communicate that and how we might work with different people to build that. Okay, hello everyone. We made it back. I'm not sure where we all went, but we made it back into the same space, and I'm pleased for one about that. I thought I was quite technically literate, but then Zoom, whole new world. It'd be great to hear from a few people about what you discussed in different rooms. And Daniel, I assume you're going to unmute people to help that process. Did we have any volunteers? Anne Petrie in group 5. The stage is yours.
Hello, good evening everyone. Thanks Tom. So we opened talking a bit about the quote from Augustine of Hippo about pray as though everything depended on God, but work as though everything depends on you, as kind of how we balance being active in change versus praying for it, and how and that was kind of our opening comment, but it tied in nicely with our closing comments as well, which were around the fact that if we're aiming, our ambition is for a more just world, the hope would be that hearts that are following Jesus would be more open to the policies that are going to help get us to a more just place. And then in the middle, we gallivanted around the eco-church movement. One of the ladies, Alison, had done some training on that, and about how our churches can, as individual churches, can be more eco. And then that led into some other conversations around, are we seeing a shift away from individualism back towards more collectivism on our streets and in our towns, and you know, in essence, neighbourliness, but writ large. And on the back of that, also localism. We had a local councillor who was doing a lot of good stuff in the place they lived, but also that actually there's lots of local layers of local government that are potentially quite influential around policies, you know, transport, roads and other things that might have a big impact on climate change.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. It's definitely something that I've experienced over this last few weeks, is a much bigger community feeling on my street. So whatever that will look like over the coming years is really interesting. Okay, so we've got some more people, and let's try and stick to a minute each so we can get through a few. Michael Harrison, do you want to say something next?
Okay, I'm up here in North Wales. We heard from Moss Side, Sunderland, Llandudno, York and Glasgow.
United Nations.
Yeah, very, very different situations. There was some talk about, if Christians are very, very good at service, we're good at food banks, for instance, night shelters, how do you make sure you have a lot of energy left over to work for change? Because those things can sap the total energy of a community, a church. It left me wondering when people were talking about how conversations could be more local, more people be involved, and the comment just now about the community spirit on the streets. We need a new politics. People like Extinction Rebellion have talked about that, of course, with citizens' assemblies. But actually, you need some facilitation in order to give many people their voices back, which they don't think they have anymore.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, there's some really interesting points there, which I feel like we should talk about this for the rest of the evening rather than just an hour. But we'll move on to Matt Wilson. You've got some things to say, I think, for a change.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So yeah, we had quite a wide range. Our chat, and perhaps it was my fault because I sort of exercised perhaps a bit too much influence, but we ended up having a kind of a policy type, slightly wonkish conversation about what would we do if it was our job to spend billions of pounds on economic stimulus post-COVID. How would we spend that on things that are good in terms of Green New Deal, etc., etc. So we had a whole bit of that conversation was about cleaning up transport and whether that would create jobs potentially at the same time, because we had to do a lot of adaptations to our transport network in order to get there, and moving people away from out of their cars and to become, do more walking and cycling, etc. We acknowledge that actually just simply more working from home is a good thing, and how could we just kind of try and embed that so that we don't go back to the sort of the old way of 5 days a week, lots of long commutes, backwards and forwards, and sort of perhaps supporting and embedding maintaining. People talked about, we had one person on our call who works for a union. It often involves a lot of traveling to conferences in faraway places, and can they be brought online? We talked about the care sector. We just simply need to, I think we acknowledged, that was Toller, acknowledged that the care sector is by nature, it's often very local, and it's not particularly carbon intensive, one person caring for another, perhaps in a care home or in their own home. But actually, those kind of jobs are understaffed and underpaid. And so just simply by supporting that sector, you're supporting a sector that is low carbon by nature. And then finally, we talked about decarbonising homes, which Tom, you probably know, is one of my little hobby horses. So there's a heck of a lot of work to be done there. So yeah, I think, moving us off our kind of gas guzzling boilers and onto more efficient energy sources to warm our homes is a good way of spending our money in the future.
Fantastic. And yeah, I'm really pleased that some of us have spoken about policy stuff, because I think one of the things that we can facilitate as Christians on the left is bringing people, whether it's like-minded people or people who don't have a platform elsewhere, together to talk through policy stuff. So, and I know there's some real experts in this call today on low carbon heating. So Tom Collins from Worcester is someone to definitely talk to you about that. But yeah, I'm really happy to continue this conversation in the future. And we'll go to one more feedback, which is from Matt Bunday, all the way from Southampton.
Hello. Some of what we said was already covered, but I think one point that I felt keen on at the start was that actually, although Labour are making a lot about saying stuff can't really go back to the way it is, I think that's probably being echoed in society. I think a lot of people who are who are politically very neutral are saying this is an opportunity, if dealt with in the right way, to make things better. And actually, we're seeing a lot of advantage. We're seeing a lot of good ideas around mutual aid groups, and around like what we've said around traveling differently. And actually, I think this has been a proven concept that people can work from home and still kind of connect with people. There were some comments about saying, well, working from home is great, but actually let's not forget the people that don't have great internet access, and let's not lose that connectivity, and let's not lose that personal touch, so that we're not kind of away all the time. But I think we were all agreed that there was, it would be a shame if in 3-4 years' time it was back to the same kind of throwaway society with lots of short haul planes, and actually when you take a train it's a lot nicer and it's a lot more kind of therapeutic. And the final point I think would be just about, in terms of what happens next, it's got to start with our own actions, whether we be councillors or business people or teachers or whatever. There's an awful lot that we can do on a very small level to do whatever we can to make things better going forward, and not to lose those good pieces of yeah, you know what I mean. So I had about 2 minutes on this, so hopefully that was useful.
Brilliant, yeah. And so one of the things in my thinking is that there needs to be some spending, government spending, and it's kind of amazing that years of austerity where we have a government that might spend some money now, and how we shape that and make sure that's the correct spending is really interesting. And there's so much promises on building or repairing roads, which doesn't feel like that's got the climate crisis in mind. So maybe how do we shape that? Okay, we've got
just on that as well. One thing that I know I'm quite often the ghost at the feast person with this stuff, but something that I found frankly amazing, and some people shared this as negative news, but I thought it was incredible. We've had a 17% drop in carbon emissions since the start of lockdown. And some people will say, but that we've all had to sit in our homes and not go anywhere or do anything, and it's only dropped 17%. But we haven't actually done anything differently yet. We're still using the same economic systems. We're still globally imagining the world in basically the same way we do now, just with slightly fewer long-haul holiday flights and more people working from home. So the potential for greater drops with real systemic change is enormous. So I found that really encouraging. I think we can see stuff like that, and it's important as well that we frame those things well, because people can read it and hear it and think that means that I'm going to be, if we do a climate future, I can't go out anywhere or do anything, because how else are we going to bring it down? But that's not what it means. It means that by changing almost nothing, we've already dropped 17%.
Sure. And yeah, so much potential. There's so much waste in our economy, isn't there? So there's so much we can change. Yeah, we've got 2 minutes until 9 o'clock. We may go over by 2 or 3 minutes, but I'd just like to finish with some questions and some challenges to send us all away from. So for me, for us on this call today, I'd say we've got a role as people engaged in the political world to be engaging with a variety of spheres, whether that's personally in our own homes or locally or regionally or nationally. And I would really encourage you to find out what you can be doing to help promote a cleaner future. I really get that the context of one of the earlier messages saying that can we do everything without burnout? Yeah, that's difficult, but just encourage you to find out what those things that you could do are. So for me, there may be community groups, including but not limited to churches near you, that are thinking about climate activism. They might be working up proposals for a regeneration project or campaigning for safer cycling. I wonder what it is that you can do in your community to engage with shaping this response to the COVID crisis with climate issues in mind. And then more broadly, and as a member of the Labour Party, it would be bad of me not to mention, but there's the Labour Party and other political groups locally and nationally. And how can you be shaping the thinking of your local branch? How can you be shaping the thinking of your local CLP, the officers of the CLP? What about the elected representatives of the local Labour Party, the councillors, the MPs, or the peers? How can you engage with them? How can you campaign, influence, and actually bless them in a way that prioritizes building back with thinking around the Green New Deal? And then there are local authorities that actually, my experience as someone who works for one, are really keen and doing a good job of this stuff. They have officers and elected members that are working hard on the climate crisis. They're working hard during this pandemic as well. Local authorities may be shaping what our communities look like in the future. They already are now, and how they rebuild. And there may be local campaigns you can get involved with. You could campaign your local authority to improve that 500-metre section of cycleway just outside your house, or to get involved with community tree planting. My question is, how can you influence, encourage, and cheer on your local authorities? Can you write to your councillor and ask for action? Do you know them? Have you got to know your local councillor? Are they a friend? Can you then give them some ideas for your community? And then there's the wider economy. Can we be encouraging local businesses, whether it's the environmentally focused vegan cafe around the corner or the high polluter in the town that's looking to reduce their emissions? How can you change your shopping habits? How can you change your travel habits to influence cleaner business? And then there's this bigger campaign that we can be really clear to government with asks about the climate crisis, asks about how we should respond, where our spending should go. And we should organise to lobby our government as it looks to rebuild, and actually as it prepares to host the climate talks in Glasgow next year. The influence that we could have not only in our own nation in decarbonising, but across the world to help decarbonise. So how can you engage in your own community? How can you engage politically? How can you engage to your local authority? How can you engage to the wider economy? And how can you engage with the government on all this stuff? Let's just read back what Isaiah said at the start. You'll use the old rubble of past lives to build anew. Rebuild the foundations from out of your past. You'll be known as those who can fix anything. Restore old ruins, rebuild and renovate, make the community livable again. And that is a prophetic call that I'm putting on all of you tonight. I'm saying that over each one of you. How do we as Christians come out of this time of lockdown, time of fear and pandemic, and make the community livable again? So my request to you as we leave and as we conclude this is to take an action this week that you haven't done before, this week or this month, or even this year, but take an action to influence intervention in the climate crisis as we come out of the COVID crisis. That's my challenge and that's my request. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm looking forward to the rest of the summer school with some engaging things, and I'll hand back to Louise or Daniel to tie things up.
Thank you ever so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. Just want to say thank you to Hannah and Tom. That was such an insightful discussion, and I hope that our members really enjoyed it. Just to remind you that next week we are looking at housing and homelessness. So please do sign up for that event, and we look forward to seeing you next Monday. Thanks for all the discussions in the chat as well. I have been making a note, and I know that there is an appetite for further discussion on that. So I've made a few notes, and we'll look forward to doing some more discussion and debate and policy making in autumn. But thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of the evening, and we'll see you next Monday. Thank you very much. Bye bye now.